Having explored the consequences of reorganizations, we should more squarely consider what exactly a reorganization is. For this purpose, we will now limit ourselves to acquisitive reorganizations. We will come back to structural and divisive reorganizations, or divisions if you will, later in the course. The biggest point to consider here is that in order to have a reorganization, you have to have a transaction that fits one of the descriptions of a reorganization under Section 368A1. So that means the transaction must satisfy all the conditions of one of those descriptions, as well as the overriding requirements for reorganizations discussed earlier in the course. That is why it is so critical to understand the definition of a reorganization. It is not enough to have a transaction that appears to satisfy the theoretical underpinnings of a reorganization. You must fit your transaction within one of the pigeonholes of Section 368A1. You should also note that the type of reorganization is oftentimes referred to based on where you find the description in Section 368A1. So, for example, an A reorganization is a reorganization described in Section 368A1A, while a B reorganization is a reorganization described in Section 368A1B, etc. With that backdrop, the natural place to start is with A reorganizations under Section 368A1A. Section 368A1A includes in the definition of a reorganization a statutory merger or consolidation. In essence, this requires that the transaction be pursuant to the merger or consolidation statute of a particular jurisdiction. A mere contract for an exchange of assets does not qualify. So for purposes of this course, do not assume that a transaction is a merger or consolidation unless the facts state so. With both a merger and consolidation, the assets of the old corporation or corporations become assets of the acquirer, all by operation of law. Similarly, the creditors and potential creditors of the merged corporation or corporations become creditors and potential creditors of the acquiring corporation, again, all by operation of law. Turning to problem 6, unless otherwise indicated, assume that C is a corporation wholly owned by A, an individual. W is a corporation wholly owned by B, an individual. In 1A, C merges into W pursuant to Delaware state law. A receives 50% cash and 50% W stock. So again, in terms of the total amount received by A, 50% is cash and 50% in value is W stock. Does this transaction represent a reorganization? This represents a plain vanilla A reorganization. Both the statutory and overriding requirements have been satisfied. In question 1B, suppose instead that the merger is pursuant to Bermuda law. Well, until recently, this change of facts presented a substantial obstacle to qualifying the transaction as an A reorganization. But Regulation 1.368-2B1 has been changed such that reorganizations do not require use of domestic merger law. It can be under a foreign country's merger law. You should, however, continue to consider the effects of sections such as 367, generally involving the application of subchapter C in the context of foreign corporations. Now, to be clear, I will not be discussing or analyzing Section 367 in either of my courses. I assume this is being handled in the international tax courses. In question 1C, suppose that instead of the facts in A receives 80% cash and 20% W stock. And so of the total consideration received by A, 80% is cash and 20% in value is W stock. Is this a good reorganization? Well, this transaction satisfies the language of Section 368A1A. Nonetheless, it is not an A or any other type of reorganization. Why not? Well, because it does not satisfy one of the overriding requirements, the requirement of continuity of shareholder interest. 20% is insufficient consideration to reach continuity of shareholder interest. So what this question reemphasizes is that while you must have a transaction that qualifies as a reorg under Section 368A1, it is not enough to have a transaction described in 368A1. One must also satisfy the overriding requirements. In question 1D, suppose instead that C and W merge into NewCo. A and B each receive 50% of NewCo stock in the transaction. Does this transaction represent a good reorganization? Well, this question illustrates what is meant by the term consolidation. It is the combining of two or more companies into one new corporation, all pursuant to statute. As a consolidation, the transaction qualifies as an A reorganization. Note that a consolidation for purposes of having a reorg is not the same as filing consolidated tax returns or having a consolidated group. It is also unrelated to consolidating for financial accounting purposes. And so again, this term consolidation under 368A1A has this particular meaning, the combining of two or more corporations into one new corporation, all pursuant to statute. Now, why do an A reorganization? Well, the big advantage of an A reorganization is that there is a great deal of flexibility in the consideration that one can use. The tax statute does not itself impose any restrictions, as would be the case with other types of reorganizations, as we shall see. So one can structure a transaction with a great deal of cash or other boot, and the stock used can generally be non-voting and or preferred stock. The only significant restrictions on consideration used are those overriding requirements such as continuity shareholder interest requirement. The big disadvantage is that the transaction must be under statutory merger or consolidation law. One consequence of this is that the target must cease to exist and the acquirer takes over the target's assets and, perhaps more to the point, the liabilities of the target. Also, state statutes impose restrictions on mergers, including required votes by shareholders as well as dissenters' rights. In question 2A, C merges into W and A receives W stock. W then drops down the former C assets to NewCo, a wholly owned sub. Is this still a good reorganization? Well, Section 368A2C provides that an A reorganization will remain valid even if the acquiring corporation subsequently drops down the assets to a controlled subsidiary. So yes, this is a good A reorganization. Also note that Section 368B2 includes both the parent and the subsidiary as parties to the reorganization, a term which we will notice will become important. In question 2B, suppose instead that W drops half of the C assets to NewCo and half to S, both wholly owned subsidiaries. Does this change your answer? Well, you are allowed to drop down assets to multiple corporations and still have the transaction qualify as an A reorganization. So this transaction is a good reorganization. Turning to mergers of affiliated corporations. A transaction qualifying as an A reorganization on its face that is really just a disguised dividend should be treated as a dividend. This concept is sometimes referred to as the Badgley Doctrine, so named because of a case to this effect. Similarly, if a transaction falls under Section 304, it would be treated under that section. This could have a similar effect, to treat a transaction which might look like a reorganization on its face as a dividend. In question 3, as illustrated in the diagram on the PowerPoint, an individual owns 100% of two corporations, X and Y. Pursuant to state law, X merges into Y. Pursuant to the merger, A receives 50% cash and 50% stock. Assume that the consideration received equals A's basis in X. Assume that X and Y have earnings and profits. How will this transaction be treated for tax purposes? Well, this transaction appears on its face as an A reorg, with the apparent result that realized gain would be recognized to the extent of boot received. But here, there would be no realized gain because A's basis equals the fair market value of what A received. Under Section 304, though, the transaction could be recast as a redemption, which could be treated as a dividend to the extent of E&P. We next consider creeping mergers. Looking at question 4, W buys all of C stock for cash. C then merges into W. Is this a good reorganization? Well, a purchase of all of a corporation's stock for cash, followed by a merger, does not qualify as a reorganization, although a different result occurs if the initial purchase was a qualified stock purchase for purposes of Section 338. Because this transaction does represent a qualified stock purchase, this is a good reorganization. Turning to question 4b. Suppose instead that W buys C stock 50% for cash and 50% for W stock. C then merges into W. Is this a good reorganization? Where you have a purchase of all the stock of the target for stock and cash followed by a merger, this can qualify as a good reorganization. So the transaction in this question appears to be a good reorg. What the facts of question 4 more generally bring up is the possibility of reversing the order of events. The exchange where the stock goes to historic target shareholders occurs before the merger in question 4. But it may not matter because the steps could be collapsed under the step transaction doctrine.